Hey, good morning. So, a little bit of a history lesson, if you will, a bit of a discussion about Christianity's past, where it might be going, and some of the challenges of postmodernism and what does that actually mean. It's one of the more confusing subjects for a lot of people, and something that a lot of people are actually kind of challenged by. So, Christianity and postmodernism, are they really enemies or are they friends? There's some people like David McAllister who pointed out that the good news is that secular humanism is on the way out. Bad news is that something worse is taking its place. Something worse is called postmodernism. Now, to this, Stanley Grentz obviously has written here, evangelicals have often uncritically accepted the modern view of knowledge, despite the fact that at certain points, the postmodern critique is more in keeping with Christian theological understandings. Now, along those same lines, one of the things that I find often happens is that Christians, by and large, will sit and accept whatever is being told to them from the scientific community and never really ever challenge it. And to me, that's kind of annoying. We accept the idea of climate change, even though those numbers don't reflect it. They don't reflect climate change at all. They simply reflect a normal weather pattern that is very cyclic. They accept the science of certain pandemics, except for when it doesn't really seem to match up to the fear mongering that the news media seems to make it out to be. We accept that there are certain other things that we should or could possibly be doing that really drive people crazy in terms of this science or that science, and even the idea that somehow the Bible and science in general don't seem to get along. We accept it, we go along with it, and then we try to fold Christianity around it. And that just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And this is something we have to be really, really careful about. Now, modernism, it is kind of like what we're going to talk about is what is it? What is postmodernism? What is postmodernism in the culture? And what's the Christian response, what it could be, maybe what it should be. Now, here's a kind of just a brief intellectual history. There was the pre-modern age, the modern age, and then what is currently considered the post-modern age. Now, under the pre-modern age, we started seeing the ideas of rationalism. It bred skepticism that walked us into the modern age. Then we started seeing ideas like relativism that started breeding situationalism and ideas that didn't really seem to make a lot of sense. Now, relativism, when it's applied to morals, when it's applied to humanity as a whole, seems to try to make the decision that whatever is whatever is right in that situation as it is dictated specifically by that individual who's in that situation. So if the person's hungry enough and they really want to eat the other human, that should be okay. There was a real seismic shift in all of this. In kind of the pre-modern time period, we had a belief in divinity. We believed in God. We believed in what the Bible told us. During that modern period, this is about the 1800s, we started kind of getting ambivalent about divinity. And part of it was because we started seeing ideas like evolution. We had various theorists out there like Hegel and Marx and some of these other folks who were trying to say, well, the church isn't that great. We really shouldn't be advocating for this. And then in postmodernism, we decided to say, okay, well, divinity is really a form of self-expression. You are your own God. We started in pre-modern times to say that, there's conviction, there is virtue. Tolerance really is evil. We shouldn't allow this sort of thing. Modernism said, well, rationality really is the virtue. We should really think these things through. We should really conceptualize and review all of these various issues. Postmodernism, tolerance is the virtue, unless, of course, it's a tolerance for a Christian idea. And the whole idea of having any kind of a conviction about anything is considered bad or evil. In the pre-modern time, we thought that all authority stayed and laid with God. During the modern era, again, this is around the 1800s, We started saying, okay, well, authority is logic and science, not with God. God was this mythological idea coming from a book filled with mythologies and stories that were probably, good lessons to learn from, but not really something you can live your life by. Postmodernism, authority is self or the group. This is where we start running into the idea that you can have the majority being abused by a minority, where you start seeing individuals who might be suffering from some form of mental health disorder dictating what the larger majority should and shouldn't believe and what they should and shouldn't tolerate, all in the name of tolerance. In the pre-modern era, we saw a lot of change brought about by an adherence to a standard, basically saying, look, here is right and wrong, what is moral, what is amoral, what is considered, lying is bad, murder is bad, that sort of thing. Modernism, again, change brought about by what is rational, meaning that they started to say, okay, well, if we can debate this and discuss this and we all agree on it, then maybe this is the way we should go. Postmodernism, change really is contingent on self-expression and culture. So whatever the hippies feel like doing, that should be okay. Not really a great way to live. Pre-modernism, we saw what was more Catholicism. It was the universal church, of which started to really get twisted and dark because, well, frankly, it revealed the sinful nature of man. Man who decided that there was a way to make money based on the way that they were approving of different sins, this sort of thing, and they saw that they had power. These two things together always create problems. We then ran into the Renaissance in the 1500s and the start of the development of humanism. This was also the development of Protestantism. Martin Luther came along and shook the entire world. Early modernism and the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, we started to really see in the early 1800s this whole embracing of that the church was inherently bad and that we should instead start to seek knowledge for knowledge's sake. Late modernism, we started seeing deism. We started even seeing this in the founders of our own country, people like Jefferson, who weren't really sure if Jesus had been God or not, but he had created his own Bible, clipping out all the things that Jesus had said, because that was a part that he felt that he needed to embrace. They felt that God put things into motion and then kind of stepped back out of the way. This is what deism is. There became a whole lot of skepticism built around the idea that, well, maybe God is there, but what about evolution? Postmodernism is this full-blown embracing of this idea that science and scientism is really the religion that they should be following, and that if it feels good, just do it, so long as you're not really hurting anyone, and if you are hurting someone, just have a really good reason for it. In the pre-modern age, we really would say that that was the Middle Ages. It was kind of the height of Christendom. You had knowledge based on faith and authority. Anselm of Canterbury said basically, I believe in order to know. This is during a time period where Isaac Newton and guys of that nature and that caliber were writing as many papers, if not more, on theology as they were on science. They believed and saw that the world was an incredibly ordered place, and somewhere that obviously all of these rules were in place, and if all of these rules were in place, then it indicates design. If there is, in fact, evidence of design, then there is evidence of a designer. The late Middle Ages, you started to see a lot more scholasticism. You started seeing people who reached back to the early era of Aristotle and Plato. The 1500s, just craziness. You saw the Renaissance, you saw the Reformation, you saw in Italy the whole idea of 3 different popes. It was a time period where they wanted to celebrate God and art and Leonardo da Vinci and his science and his drawings, and Botticelli and Michelangelo and all of these individuals who basically wanted to seem very, very pious and religious, but all at almost a Pharisee type level. The scientific revolution started early on, but it really didn't catch steam until the 1800s. We had Copernicus, we had Kepler, we had Galileo, we had individuals who were going out and identifying, hey, maybe the whole idea, the way we've interpreted the Bible is wrong, and maybe the earth, in fact, revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Maybe we've gotten a few of these other pieces wrong. Maybe the planet isn't flat. Maybe it's actually round, and that nature was to be commanded. Maybe it was just, to be obeyed. The end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes, the secret motions of things, the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. Humans will conquer nature. This idea was built around the concept that if we could understand first causes, then we could, in fact, try to formulate and control all of the laws that stem from those first cause. There was a willful defiance against the idea that we could accept and embrace that there was a single cause, a single great cause behind all of it. And instead, there must be a series of causes that all played a role in what would later be considered evolution. We started also to see the birth of modernism in guys like René Descartes, who was both a mathematician as well as a philosopher. A lot of crazy ideas came out of the French. We had a whole lot of time periods where great, massive swaths of individuals were being lost to various types of diseases, up to including Isaac Newton, who wrote down and created some of his greatest writings during the time period of the Black Plague and the last great lockdowns of society. Descartes identifying that I think, therefore I am, and as such, reason is king. Basically saying that humans were the highest form of anything. Now, modernism is autonomous, rational, human ideas. Descartes meets the mechanical universe of Newton and Newtonian physics. We are in control of our universe because we're starting to understand and appreciate all of the rules that govern it. Modernism is essentially optimistic. It's built around the idea that we can conquer and do and achieve anything. Some of those very ideas are what propelled America and other countries to try to reach for the stars and to try to land on the moon. Knowledge was considered to be objective, good, and accessible to all humans. Science during that time period wasn't necessarily something that was bought and paid for. It was something that was considered above reproach. Human reasoning is the ultimate authority for truth. It ignores, however, the sinful nature of man, that man and all of his biases can be swayed. The Enlightenment brought about the age of reason. Using reason, we can ask and answer all important questions. It elevates the role of the individual and the value of the personal freedom. But how was that going to actually impact Christianity? What we identify is that there are a lot of things that come out of this that are not very helpful. We start to see a restoration movement. We started to see the common sense philosophy. We started to see a lot of people who were trying to scientifically analyze the Bible, completely ignoring the fact that our level and understanding of science at that time period was incredibly pathetic. We had very poor technology, and I had a complete inability to truly understand what it was that we were looking at. We try to evaluate the gifts and amazing aspects of the Bible through the realm of tools such as a light microscope that was candle powered. We didn't even have electricity as yet. We couldn't fully comprehend the depths of the oceans simply because we had no ability to even create sonar. We had no idea what was going on. Just in fact, the other day, a naval warship or a naval submarine ran into a previously uncharted underground or under ocean underwater mountain. So here, even in modern times, we're still running into things that we didn't know were there using modern technology. Now, some of the problems we started to see, though, in the modern church was that we started to stress doctrine over practice. We started to get hung up on individual lines within the Bible. You'd start to see kind of the birth of Methodism, which would later become the Methodist Church. You'd start to see the birth of Calvinism, Arminianism. We'd start to see people get hung up not on the message of Christ, but rather on trying to see who really was special and who was not. We try to say that only if you did this, this, and this, were you going to be right with God, rather than saying, well, no, this is actually what God said. This is how you get right with God. We would get hung up on interpreting individual lines, and we would see the birth of the Jehovah Witness movement, where they would think that life was in the blood and therefore they could get no blood transfusions. You would see groups like the birth of the Mormon Church and others who saw that a developing postmodern church, a developing church that was slowly slipping away from the Bible itself and its universal ideas and approaches, were now becoming segregated and split apart and pushed out as a result of all of these different Protestant branches. Yes, we all agreed that we weren't going to be Catholic, but somehow we couldn't agree on what exactly we were going to agree on. We started to see more sectarian and less ecumenical. We started to say, okay, it's not about the ceremony. We are just going to be better than everyone else because we are the Christians, and therefore we get to be all kinds of judgy. We started seeing people more concerned about with how you looked when you went to church as opposed to the fact that you were just in church. There was more emphasis on preaching and more emphasis on worship and less on individual study. It relies on evidence, a stronger emphasis on verbal inspiration of the Bible. Hence, we started seeing a lot more people that if they were incredibly charismatic, they could develop really large followings. This is a time period where, had Joel Osteen been around or some of his ilk, you would have found tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals following right behind them as if they were the modern day Pied Piper. Modernism is not dead, by the way, but we would run right into World War I, World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We would start to question some of the incredibly evil things that mankind seemed to be able to do. There was an exposure to alternative worldviews from the East. We started seeing a whole lot of individuals who would embrace transcendental meditation. They'd start to embrace ideas of yogis and Sufis and the New Age movement. Pessimism and rejection of, by most of modernism, individuals who simply couldn't be held to the standards that the modern churches at that time were embracing. We would see the rise of intellectual postmodernism, people like Nietzsche saying that God is dead, truth is dependent on language, truth is created, not discovered, and trying to say that in essence that everyone's truth was their own, that there were no universal truths. Keep in mind, this is the same guy who would die alone and penniless in his sister's house and bordering on insane. Martin Heidegger, another philosopher, would reject the correspondence theory of truth. He would say that truth was relational. Truth is found in culture, narrative, and not facts. They would start to embrace more and more this idea of a subjective truth rather than there being absolute truths. There were a big three, Foucault, Derrida, and Rorty. Michael Foucault, truth is a fabrication or a fiction. Science is the ideology. History has no objective meaning. It is socially produced, and truth is social. This is a guy who really would have loved the idea of saying that basically history was completely fraudulent simply because it was written by the victors. Jacques Derrida Reading is a violent act of mastery over the text. It is invented deconstructionism. Oftentimes, these are individuals who are embraced at the highest levels of universities, of colleges, because they too have attempted to read what they have written and they don't understand it either, but they try to sound really, really clever. Richard Rorty would come out and identify truth as a matter of human convention. Truth is found in coherence rather than in correspondence. Coherence to what? It was always going to be the big question. Postmodern thinking is that postmoderns have no worldview, except the view that there is no correct worldview. Truth is found in the community, not in the individual, and sometimes in the individual and not in the community. Postmodernism rejects ontological truth, meaning truth at face value. That there's no ideas that are, meta narratives, things that would be acceptable except for relativism. The goal of postmodern scholarship is to deconstruct beliefs such as Christianity and to find out where it came from and to destroy its violent meta-narrative and to make it meaningless. Part of what it attempts to do is to say that whatever you find in the Bible can't be true. And we're going to deconstruct that because we're going to say, well, if I can start in the beginning and deconstruct the idea of Genesis and destroy this concept that God put it all into motion and that God gave a purpose to both a man and a woman, and that God embraced just absolutely encouraged the idea of marriage between a single man and a single woman, and that this would become the universal foundation for family and for the building up of societies and great cultures. They would try to tear it all apart, and they would start in that very beginning. If they could undermine the very beginning of the Bible, then they could in turn undermine the entire Bible, and as a result, destroy this whole idea that there was ever any one type of designed concept associated with man or mankind as a whole. That man had no purpose. His purpose was whatever he said it was, not what God said it was. It would allow for and create this idea that we could say that human life didn't even really begin at birth, that instead it was just a clump of cells that were acting as a parasite inside of the mother who happened to be the host. Therefore, it was okay to destroy it. Postmodernism and culture. Postmoderns prefer difference to uniformity, except for when you see them all dressing pretty much the same. They're rather uniform, but they won't embrace it. They try to say heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. And this meaning that, if a whole bunch of Antifa guys dressed in black with their goth makeup and big black boots and things of that nature, they're all trying to claim that they are individuals, even though they all dress exactly the same. Postmoderns prefer local over universal. Think globally, act locally. Now, what they mean by this is basically let us control what happens at the local level in the hopes that it can actually have a positive impact at a global level. But don't judge anyone at the global level, because really their rules are what are appropriate at their local level. Postmoderns value the community over the individual. This is where we get some of the basic components of communism, is that it is the community over the individual. The individual has no rights, and the individual who's not contributing to society as a whole for the betterment of society or of that community really is useless, that each individual is nothing better than a cog in the wheel of what should be a larger community industrial machine. Postmodernist is not searching for truth, but collecting experiences. Therefore, they're constantly looking for ways to improve what's going on with them and nothing else. Postmodernist is really, it's everything that you see in the current pop culture. Pop culture reflects exactly what postmodern culture or postmodern thinking is. If it feels good, do it. Fame, money, do whatever you want to people. Will Smith and his wife now trying to say that they have a open relationship as an example, and are out dating other individuals while at the same time undermining the integrity of their own marriage. People like the New York Times out there encouraging folks to embrace maybe the alternative lifestyle of pedophilia, and embracing the ideas of polyamory and polygamy, saying that those two could be great concepts to explore, completely ignoring what and why we ever said that it needed to be just one girl and one guy. The strengths of postmodernism: it celebrates cultural and other kinds of diversity. This is true. It does celebrate them, but at the sacrifice of ones they don't agree with. Supposedly it's open-minded, and supposedly it's tolerant, but its tolerance goes well beyond what it should be tolerant of. As an example, it may tolerate that we may have a completely over joyful rampage of individuals who are burning down the city and just calling it relatively peaceful demonstrations. They tend to have a more accurate view of history than the modern view. They're open to Eastern and other ways of thinking. They're not married to Western ideas as the good of, or a good way of thinking. They celebrate relationships and community, and they refute the false and prideful claims of modernism, especially the idea that humans can discover truth. They simply think that all truth is relative. There are a lot of weaknesses in postmodernism. It denies the existence of truth when truth is real. Its most basic premise is simply not true. Surely science is onto something. Circular reasoning: are you absolutely sure there is nothing absolute? There is no absolute truth. There's no moral compass. This is actually the really scary part out of all of it. These are the same people who come up with movies like Purge and Squid Games. Dismisses the role of the revolutionary, the idealist, for example, of Jesus. And it reduces the importance of the individual down to the human having no value or dignity really at all, unless you're just talking about that individual, their own narcissism and egotistical approach to what values them. Christianity clearly includes a propositional truth that Jesus, your word is truth, in John 17:17. Christianity tells us history is a story, and God reveals himself in his story. Postmodernists, there's no center, there is no meta-narrative, whereas Christianity, Jesus is the center and Jesus is the salvation. That is the meta-narrative. Postmodernism can be a helpful critique to modernist approach to scripture, but it rejects the idea that a scripture has a single interpretation. It is unacceptable in the Christian context. Basically, the postmodernist fails to acknowledge that Jesus is anything more than a good teacher, but can't embrace the idea that even this teacher said that he was God. There is a lot of challenge associated with this, in the sense that if you embrace the postmodernist idea, then love has no meaning, even though within the Bible we say at least 7 different types of very specific forms of love, of which you're supposed to be researching and coming up with a paper on. There are some other strengths. It allows us to recognize that in Christianity, which is not strictly rational, some aspects really are just kind of by faith. It helps us appreciate that there are some mysterious aspects of Christianity. It helps us know that principles have different applications in different cultures. It helps us recognize that much of what we call Christianity is just Americanity and Westernism, and that we view most things through this lens. And I would argue that this is a mistake, that really so much of Christianity should be re-reviewed from a Middle Eastern cultural standpoint. It actually adds a whole lot of depth and a lot more meaning to many of the things that Jesus said, as well as many of the things that are written in the Old Testament. It's helpful in hermeneutics to recognize the influence of culture and a worldview on Scripture. It rightly points out that the Enlightenment ideal of discovering universal truth through rational analysis is not realistic. It helps us to understand that why not all will interpret the Bible the same. It will help us to be less judgmental when this might be a good idea. So as an example, how I interpret the Bible will be absolutely different than how other people interpret the Bible, simply because I have a different set of life experiences that have created biases in me. It therefore moves me away from being strictly adherent to a single, if you will, religion, and more focused on the idea of actually being involved in a relationship with Christ. It helps us to appreciate and celebrate the communal aspects of Christianity and defeat the hyper-individualism which has crept into the church. The early church, if you look at Acts, very much was commune-based. It was really this whole idea of everyone coming together, sharing what they had, and leaning into each other in an entirely different form of fellowship than what we do today. Fellowship today is nothing more than showing up to church and singing a few songs and listening to a pastor. That's not what fellowship really is. Koinonia, which is where the Greek term comes from, was actually built around the idea that it was a commune type of experience. It was something that was built around each other leaning into others during times of sorrow, during times of happiness, during times of illness, helping and reaching into each other's lives in such a way that they felt integrated and a part of something much larger. It helps us to remember to do social good and to be involved in our communities. It's eclectic. It's more open to a wide variety of ideas and beliefs. These are things that we see in the postmodern church. Not always a good idea. It's more interested in community and relationships than individual faith, and I think that this is really a loss. We also see that the modern church, or postmodern church, I should say, is more socially aware and more oriented towards social justice and less interested in doctrine. We see that the postmodern church is rejecting propositional truth. It's anti-dogmatic. It's value broad-mindedness. It's a response to dogmatic modern and fundamentalist Christianity and a response to the megachurch movement. It rejects leadership and authority. It has spontaneous worship services. Judges, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit, basically. Both and rather than either or approaches to the truth. Basically, it's a whole lot of yes buts. It will tend to emphasize life over truth, orthopraxy over orthodoxy. Your life is a measure of your religion, not your beliefs. How good are you at singing the hymns? Or how good are you at, did you show up and spend your time in youth group as well as in regular church practice? And are you there on Sunday as well as Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and et cetera, et cetera? Identifying that Christianity is not supposed to be judgmental, not primarily about salvation, but about living correctly. And Christianity is more about a journey rather than a destination. I hate to break this to you, but sanctification, yes, it's a journey, but there is an end in mind, something to be considered. There's a strong emphasis on social justice. We should really just be leaving politics alone. Leans more left politically than evangelicals. Some of the quotes that kind of support this is, Christianity should be presented through loving attitudes rather than through doctrines. It's not what we believe that matters, it's what we do in serving others. The Bible is intended to teach us through narratives, lessons about life, not through statements of propositional truth. No matter what the weaknesses of the emerging churches, Maybe reactions to traditional religion are not only understandable, they are called for by the teachings of the Bible itself. The question is whether the reactions of the emerging church are in fact biblical reactions producing biblical directions. Therein lay the deeper problems that this emerging movement, or with this emerging movement. What we basically see is that we are taking steps to walk away from what the Bible says rather than and embracing culture, embracing whatever feels good, because we don't want to be seen as judgmental. We don't want to be seen as individuals who are closed-minded. We're more concerned about the names that we get called than we are about whether or not the person is saved. We care more about whether that person likes us rather than whether or not that person's going to go to hell. These are not ways to live out our faith. Now, the positive responses that make church more attractive to the postmodern mind is to maybe emphasize service in the community. I think that this is good, especially through outreach. Include a variety of kinds of music, cultural influence on how you do church. I don't think there's any right way to worship God except from the idea that you understand that it's not a performance. That if you're not genuinely worshiping God in such a way that you're pointing out that there's a gratefulness towards Him who has provided everything, that your life is better because of Him, rather than it being something more about, how's that song go? It's all about me. There are so many times that I go in and listen to worship music, depending on the church, and maybe watch people run around swinging flags or beating on drums. And while I have said that there's not any right or wrong way to worship, there are certainly some really weird ways to worship. And again, I think it should be put forward with a calculation or a review of intent. What's the intent of the worship? Is it about your ability to perform and your ability to kind of show what you can do, and you're seeking accolades for yourself rather than making a joyful noise and accolades for God and what God has done in your life? I think these are things that have to be considered. All doctrine is important. It must be taught carefully and emphasized. Doctrine will not be what draws the postmodern person into church, though I would say that the same can be said for classic apologetics. When we provide evidence, a rational mind embraces that evidence, and a rational mind will then in turn embrace what is the truth. That God so loved the world that He sent forward His only Son to die on our behalf, to create a path so that we might have a right relationship with Him. He laid out the rules in the Old Testament and showed that no matter what, people could be incredibly rebellious, and regardless of the type of discipline that was implemented, that it was never going to be enough, that in order for truly there to be a reconciliation between God and man, God would have to do it Himself in an incredibly overwhelming show of love. And that love and that reconciliation would come in the form of sacrifice, based on the rules that He laid out in the Old Testament. That there had to be a blood sacrifice for sin, and as such, He provided one. And it's not one that makes sense to any other religion. We can show through evidence that not only did this man, Jeshua ben Judah, Jesus of Nazareth, die upon that cross and suffer an excruciating crucifixion and a beating and mockery, but that the evidence also points to the fact that that grave is empty, and that He came back, and that His believers, His followers, believed so heavily in that they were willing to die rather than renounce what they knew to be true. There aren't that many things in this world that people are willing to die for, and none that I know of are willing to die for a lie. It's always something to keep in mind. Hopefully this helps you in your research as you're trying to discern and try to understand what is and are the 7 different types of love that God puts forward in the Bible, and how does it relate to postmodernism? Postmodernism is really built around the idea that we can change the nature of words and truth to be whatever we want it to be as human beings and completely ignore what they might actually be in accordance with God's love and God's rules. When we do that, it seems to me that we are in fact creating a very dangerous situation, and one that long term will do nothing but cause harm both to the hearts and minds of mankind. Hope this helps.